Good afternoon. My name is Lucan Wei. I am professor of political science at the University of Toronto and the co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine. So one of the most remarkable things about the full-scale Russian invasion is just the intense moral clarity. As a scholar, I'm used to sort of always saying, well, things are more complicated when someone asks about it than you think. In fact, what I spend most of my time is saying things are not complicated and it's actually straightforward. In terms of a sort of almost a conflict is a very much of a real kind of Star Wars quality in terms of the forces of darkness and the forces of light. And I think that was, it's very gratifying to have seen the European reaction, which I think has been quite unified, with a few exceptions around the support for Ukraine. But I first noticed something amiss in the global South when speaking with my Pakistani in-laws, who certainly do not support Putin, but were much more sort of kind of Putin curious and much less sort of kind of full-hearted in their support of Ukraine. And indeed, I think what's striking is that the kind of lack of vocal support for Ukraine in the global South. And I want to talk about that today. But today we're sort of joined by a number of different experts who can shed light on both, the perception of the Russian-Ukrainian war in the global South, and more importantly, what we can do about it. So first, we have Tymofii Brik, who's the rector of the Kyiv School of Economics, but is now safely ensconced in Chicago. He's serving at the Northwestern University as the Roberta Buffett Visiting Professor of International Studies in the Department of Sociology in the spring of 2023. Next, we have Sebastian Elischer, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. His work analyzes the interplay between identities and how identities shape and affect democratization and other political dynamics in Sub-Saharan Africa. He's very much of an Africanist. Next, from Kyiv, we have well known to all of you, Alexei Haran, who is a professor of comparative politics at Kyiv Mohyla Academy, research director of the Democratic Initiative Foundation, which is a leading Ukrainian think tank since 1992. And since the fall of 2022, he was a member of the Ukrainian civil society delegation, which visited 5 African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, and Argentina. And my understanding, you've just come back from South Africa, is that right?
Correct.
So you have a lot to say about this. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor Maria Repnikova, who's associate professor in the global communication at Georgia State University. Dr. Repnikova is an expert in Chinese politics and has written on Chinese soft power and has been a frequent commentator on the war. So I'm going to start with you, Tymofii. My understanding is that you've analyzed sort of extraordinary data that was collected in part by the Soros Foundation. Can you just tell a little bit about these surveys and what they tell us about Ukraine?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I will put a link in the chat in a few minutes to with some references to this data. There was indeed an extraordinary survey conducted in the August 2022 by the Open Society Foundation. It was published online. The report is titled Fault Lines, Global Perspectives on a World Crisis. And they surveyed more than 20,000 respondents in 22 countries, including Ukraine. And these countries, they were scattered all around the world. There were countries from Western Europe, from like Germany, France, Great Britain, the United States, but also there were countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, including India, Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, Brazil, Mexico, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Turkey. So there were quite a lot of countries. And the idea of this survey was to have a sort of to understand the reaction of people from all around the world, how they respond to the war in Ukraine, how they evaluate what was happening, how they define this war, And the focus of this research was to compare the global South versus the West, and to test empirically whether this narrative holds true. The narrative that there is sort of, the West which supports Ukraine versus the global South which does not support Ukraine. And some of the data are available online, some of the data I have analyzed myself, and I can say that, surprisingly, this narrative empirically is not sound. So we see that global South is a very broad category. There is a big variation within what people usually call global South. I will summarize it. I'll try to give a quick summary, but I can go into details later. So what we see that Latin American countries and African countries tend to sympathize to Ukraine more, while Asian countries tend to sympathize with Ukraine less. And within Europe, there is one distinct society, is Serbia, which is, well, not surprisingly, backs Russia a lot. When I say sympathize, so there were questions like whether people believe that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is an example of a large, powerful country picking on a smaller sort of underdog society, or whether this is an empire trying to subjugate a former colony. There were questions whether Ukraine is democratic and whether Russia is authoritarian. And in most of these countries, from 65 to 80% of respondents would agree with these statements positively. People indeed see Ukraine as a sort of underdog, democratic society, which is attacked about the larger villain, I would say, which is perceived as an authoritarian regime. In most countries, respondents would agree that Russia is responsible for this conflict and war crimes. And from 60 to 80%, depending on the country, most of the respondents would agree that the conflict might have devastating consequences, like it can turn into the Third World War, or it can become a nuclear threat. And I think it's also important to mention that the countries, based on that, the respondents from many countries would agree that the war has to be stopped, and yet they prefer diplomatic and legal enforcement in order to stop the war. So I'll give you some examples. I'm just checking the data now. So in many countries, like in let's say in France or Kenya, Nigeria, in Brazil, from 60 to 75% of respondents agreed that Russia, we should strip Russia of its veto right in the United Nations Security Council. From 60 to 85% of respondents, 60 in India, 80 in Colombia, 85 in Kenya, 84 in Nigeria, 70 in Brazil, agree that Russia must pay reparations to Ukraine. And there is a consensus that placing a global price cap on Russia oil should happen as a way of sanctioning. So what people disagree with, there is not a lot of agreement on an idea, of banning Russian state media outlets from broadcasting in their own country. Most respondents, about half of, from 50 to 60% of respondents would disagree with these statements. And quite a few, from 20 to 30% of respondents would agree to send soldiers to support Ukraine. So this is kind of a very broad overview. I can go in deeper details comparing the countries, but the summary of the research is that global South is not united. In most questions, Latin America and Africa tend to be more sympathetic to Ukraine, saying that this is democratic society which is under attack. That respondents from these societies, they conceive the idea of some diplomatic solutions, through vetoes or economic tools like sanctions, but people don't really appreciate the idea of military interventions or, as would we would usually colloquially say non-democratic solutions like banning media or something like that. So I think it's it's quite even surprising to see that a lot of respondents from these countries are quite positive towards Ukraine. I also run some tentative preliminary statistical models trying to understand what kind of social variables can explain variation in the behavior of these people. And what I observe is that variables like urbanization or education, they usually don't really matter in explaining this variation. However, media consumption, TV versus internet, and ideology, whether people on the left, on the right, usually these variables correlate with answers of people. And I think it's also...
How so? So
okay, yeah, so I will say now, I will elaborate on that. So in countries, so in Latin America, like respondents in Colombia and Mexico, if on the scale from left to right, if they're more pro-right, they would support Russian narratives. For example, withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. They won't support it. They would still support Russian military interventions if they're more pro-right. And in Europe, it's other way around. So respondents from Germany, Great Britain, and also United States, if on this scale they are pro-left, they would be more supportive of Russia.
okay.
So this, yeah.
So I will come back. So Sebastian, I'm going to turn it to you. I mean, you've been studying Africa for quite some time, and what's your? I mean, is this kind of jive with how you see the view of Ukraine from the African perspective?
Okay, so thank you, Lucan, and thank you for the Monk School for having me on this panel, which is really a great panel, and not sufficient research has been done on the role of the Global South and how it views that concept. Thank you so much for Tymofii for those numbers. To me, they make a lot of sense. And I want to talk a little bit about variation within Africa and why maybe it is that so many people were taken aback by the fact that not more African countries supported the UN resolutions condemning the war in Ukraine, and why not more African countries took a more active stance against Russia. And I think some of the things that I've observed and some of the things that you can see in other opinion polls, for example, the Gallup poll in Africa or Afrobarometer data, somewhat confirms what Tymofii was saying, namely that, of course, the Global South is highly complex, highly nuanced, and the same, of course, applies to Africa. Africa is not a country, it's a continent with 50 plus states, and as a result, it only makes sense that we see very different responses to the war that is unfolding in Ukraine, and part of that variation, but part of the fact why so many African countries abstained at the UN has to do with Russia, and part of that response has to do with the way the West is positioning itself towards the war in Ukraine, and how many current African administrations view the West. I don't think that there are great reservations in Africa toward Ukraine, or that African governments or African populations see the Ukraine as the perpetrator in this conflict. I think they're very much capable of seeing what happens, but there might be other reasons why they are not more outspoken about that condemnation. First of all, on the Russian side, and I was really pleased to hear that the Soros Foundation is financing efforts by the Ukraine to become more engaged in Africa and to become more engaged in conversations about Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, because Russia has kind of preempted that. And since around 2006, Putin's Russia has become much more involved in African affairs again, and there have been two strategies here. One at the elite level, which clearly is elite capture, and at the level of society, the kind of focus and concerted spread of misinformation and Russian propaganda. So since the mid-2000s, there have been many high-profile visits by Russian cabinet members and by Putin himself. And the structure here, or Russian strategy here, has been to target a special subset of African countries. So countries that are authoritarian, countries that are unstable and in which a conflict is ongoing, and countries in which the Western world has somewhat become a delegitimate player. And what Russia has done is it has offered security services in exchange for discretionary access to raw materials. And it has succeeded in some of these countries that are resource rich and that are very unstable. And the most current example is probably Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and the countries in the Sahel, so countries like Mali, Guinea, and some others. And the most prominent example of this has been the Sochi summit, the Russian-African summit in Sochi in 2019. And there's supposed to be another summit this year in the summer in St. Petersburg. So the Russian strategy here is flexible, but I would also say that it's very limited. Russia does not provide donor aid to Africa, and its security footprint on the continent is limited to Wagner. So it's unstable, and it is less grandiose or much smaller than maybe Western security commitment. Russia is not a giant on the African continent, and it also doesn't aim to become one. With regard to soft power, ever since the end of the Cold War, Russia has maintained close educational links with those African countries with whom the Soviet Union had close links. And it has focused here particularly on the hard sciences, which in developing countries share closer proximity to those in power than maybe the ever so critical social sciences. Russia increasingly has pursued close links with African civil society organizations and with the African media. Tymofii referred to this, that in his model, it appears that what matters is internet consumption. That would make sense to me, because we do know that Russia has been trying to gain greater access, especially in Francophone Africa, to African online outlets, where sort of the Russian propaganda machine has been more successful in gaining a footprint. That's probably less the case with regard to radio and television, but that has been a very discernible Russian strategy. On the African side, and this is maybe more important, I think some scholars have argued that Africa or the global South is unsympathetic, that it doesn't see the normative assumptions underlying or underwriting this war. I think that's the wrong analysis. I think very often we hear talk about indifference, and indifference is equally lethal, as we know from our studies. But I think on the African side here, indifference should not be mixed up with a lack of sympathy. So first of all, support for Russia, and here I refer to Gallup polls and Afrobarometer data, is highest in West Africa, and that's kind of telling because there is an overlap of factors there. These countries have seen French intervention in their political affairs over the course of the last 60 years, and France is still seen as an exploiter and an extractor of African raw materials. These countries are highly unstable, and part of that instability so far actually hasn't been so much Wagner, but it has been the presence of French military troops, at least from the African perception. I'm not saying this is an empirically valid statement, but I take notice of the fact that from an African opinion point of view, France and not Wagner, so therefore France and not Russia, is a major driver of instability. These countries are authoritarian. Many of them are currently under military rule. And as I said before, they are resource rich. So Western involvement here is seen as opportunistic, and it's not driven by a democratic agenda. So these are African grievances about French or EU or Western intervention in their affairs, and they should not be mixed up with a lack of recognition of Ukraine's suffering. Having said that, concerns have been raised about, first of all, again, the treatment of African migrants in Europe. Africans know the pain that Ukrainians are experiencing today. They know the pain of warfare. They know the pain of expulsion. They know the pain of losing their home. And yet they perceive their own treatment in the so-called safe havens of Western Europe to be distinctly different than the treatment that Ukrainians are receiving. The fact that many African students in Ukraine were not treated right is a matter of fact, and it did go a long way on those Russian propaganda channels, but it also did go a long way on social media, on Twitter, in the days immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Also, a lot of Africans are saying, well, look, what Ukraine is experiencing, that's not news to us, but we are being told that, you know, local solutions for local problems. So come up with an African solution. And Africans would say, well, who has failed in this conflict? Who has failed to prevent Russia's invasion? Clearly, that's Europe. And Lucan said this at the beginning. Fortunately, many Western European countries changed their stance toward Russia. But that was really when it was really too late. I mean, this has been a conflict that's in the making for, let's say, roughly a decade. I would argue since 2004, since the outbreak of the Color Revolution or the Orange Revolution. And Africans would argue this is another major conflict, on the one hand, between the West and Russia, and we are staying out of it. And it is precisely because we have an anti-colonial heritage. And one of the lessons that African countries drew from colonialism was the non-aligned movement that emerged in 1955. And one of the key principles of that movement was non-intervention and national sovereignty. So I think there is much more of a concern of African countries to be drawn into a conflict in which Africa is a bystander. It's not a major party. And there is the conviction that this really is for Europeans to back up their security services and to come up with a military force to defend Ukraine, rather than an African endeavor that from an African perspective takes place on the global periphery. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sebastian. Alexei, I'm going to turn it to you. I mean, we've heard that sort of the support for Ukraine is in public opinion polls is somewhat higher than I think some of us assumed. I mean, this is also confirmed in not just the Soros-funded surveys, but in some others. I mean, what was the reception in your experience when you went and sort of made the argument for Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you very much. But first of all, let me just not to forget, let me briefly react to 2 points raised by Sebastian. Well, I believe that the open conflict, dangerous stage of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia started not since the Orange Revolution, but it's since 2014. Before that, I would say Russia exploited its soft power in Ukraine, but, you know, basically it was kind of competition of different models. The second point, the thesis about non-alignment. Yes, we know, we hear the thesis from many countries, including South Africa in particular. So, as a student of international relations, and I was a student in the 70s, when there was a struggle for decolonization, I know pretty well that non-alignment doesn't mean neutrality. And non-alignment actually means that you are supporting the national liberation struggle, you are against colonialism, and you are against aggression. So that was the clear position of non-alignment. So basically this thesis, when you are talking to African audience or other audience, is easy, very easy to rebuff. Now about our reception in these countries. Well, first of all, I would say, I would confirm, I don't have our own sociological polls, but as we say in Ukraine, we have the most reliable poll is that what you have with taxi drivers. okay? And taxi drivers, for example, in South Africa, they know pretty well about what is Bakhmut, President Zelensky. Oh, I love this guy. That Putin is aggressor and so on and so forth. Definitely they are putting some questions and I will proceed to them. But let me start maybe that with a question, Lucan, which you wanted to ask me, but for some reason you're not asking me about Ukraine, you know, why Ukraine wasn't so active at what changed in Ukrainian position regarding Global South, right? You wanted to ask me this question. Yeah. Okay, why you didn't ask it? So that's, you know, there should be some conspirology behind.
Finally, some accountability here at the moment.
Okay, but look, guys, yeah, we didn't pay enough attention to that. That's true. This is understandable first because Ukraine, since the dissolution of this USSR, the main two vectors of Ukrainian politics were the West and Russia. So basically, most attention was paid to this basic issue. Having said that, Ukraine was quite active in Africa if we are talking about Ukrainian peacekeepers. You know, so Ukraine contributed a lot. And by the way, after the war with Russia in 2014, Ukraine didn't withdraw its peacekeeping contingents. And the last one was withdrawn only in September last year from the DRC. So actually, Ukraine performed its obligations until the very last possible moment. But what is interesting, many people to whom we are talking in African countries, they do not know about it. You know, I'm not talking about, you know, professionals or analysts who are dealing with that. But even, you know, from professors from social sciences, they do not know about this fact. So I would say that a lot of things should be clarified. Coming back to Ukraine, and yes, definitely now, one more problem is the problem of resources. That's clear. And we cannot, you know, we cannot compete with Russian propaganda because of the resources. So what I'm saying this is a battle between David and Goliath. And you know who won the victory, because the truth is on our side. Basically, I believe that one of the good things for Ukraine, for President Zelensky, for his speechwriters, you shouldn't invent something. You should just present the facts. The hard facts is on our side. It's very difficult, you know, to debate, especially, you know, I'm invited very often to the programs on Arabic channels. And it's very difficult because you have 5 minutes and 5 minutes has a guest from Moscow, most of whom are clearly associated with a certain structures, who are presenting crazy Putin's propaganda. So, you know, if you are engaged, for example, in the debate on war crimes, you know, your opponents say, no, that's you are doing war crimes. So it's very difficult to know. So you need to present hard facts. And these hard facts are that we gave up our nuclear weapons, hard fact. That Russia guaranteed our territorial integrity, hard fact. That we were a non-bloc country officially, and which was supported by most of Ukrainians before 2014, hard fact. And when you present these hard facts to African audience, for example, you know, they hear it very attentively. And a lot of them, again, they do not know about it. Look, they do not know about it. So I think these basic facts which could be provided to the audience, you know, you shouldn't be very elaborate, you know, in developing your argument. Just present these hard facts. And again, regarding one of the most important narratives which we hear in Africa, for example, that the West is colonialist and Russia was traditional supporter. Come on, guys. Was Russia a member of the United Nations? And a lot of people say, yeah, no, it was the Soviet Union. By the way, I saw that Mr. Raymond Arendt posed these questions and many other good questions. So exactly, no, it was the Soviet Union. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. And by the way, it was Ukraine, not the Soviet Union, which is very interesting, which was part of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. Guys, did you know about it? I believe not, because many people do not know about it. So we can find it. And 300 members of ANC were trained in the camp near Odessa. A lot of South African and African students studied in Ukraine. So basically we can present it, and to explain that historically Russia is not, direct successor to the Soviet Union when we are talking about the fight against colonialism. Now, it's very important definitely to look again. I believe Sebastian raised this issue that a lot of Africans, when we are talking about people sufferings in Ukraine, Africans saying, okay, we have it every day. So what's the difference? What's the point? The difference is that this is the first case when the country gave up nuclear weapons and it is attacked. So it's the overhaul of the international order in itself, which is dangerous for all the countries. And again, here comes the issue, which is very understandable for these countries. Never ever in history the nuclear power station was occupied by foreign military. Never ever. And now you have this case in Zaporizhzhia. So it's direct threat to all the countries, including Global South. Why? Because if there is an accident, then there would be radioactive contamination, and that's what would happen to grain supplies from Ukraine. So yes, here from some moral arguments, we should come to practical arguments for Africa and for other countries. Grain corridors, and nuclear safety. If you're talking about other involvement to solve the issue. Oh, by the way, again, in many cases we hear that, okay, we are in solidarity with you, we fully understand, but look, at the end of the day, you need to find a compromise with Putin. You need to find some concession, face-saving solution, and so on and so forth. To be honest, we can hear this argument not only from Africans. We hear it from a lot of Western experts itself. But when I talk to people in Africa and other Global South countries, I always saying that, okay, put you in our shoes. You are attacked, you are bombarded. It is said that you do not exist, your identity doesn't exist. What should you do? And people were saying, okay, we will fight. Guys, so what do you want from us? Okay, so now let's, and by the way, if we are talking about how to rebuff with international support, again, there was a very, here we can say that, look, we do not ask for foreign soldiers, we are asking for weapons. That's different. But there was a clear-cut case which resembles what is happening in Ukraine when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait and said there's no Kuwait, it's Iraq. So what was international community? And then you provide figures. How many soldiers and weapons were supplied from Arab countries, from Egypt, from Morocco, from Senegal, from Argentina, not much, but at least several battleships and helicopters. So there are examples when we have these international coalitions to rebuff aggressor from the territory of the country which was attacked. Finally, what to do? And this is an important point because we can hear, oh, for example, in Brazil, in South Africa, we are engaged in multilateral diplomacy, in BRICS. We would like to have negotiations, to have a ceasefire without any conditions, to have talks without any conditions. So I think the practical position should be like that. Guys, you are saying it's possible for you to mediate and influence Putin, who is your friend, who is part of BRICS. Okay, let's do the following things, which are in the interest of all. Secure grain corridors, withdraw Russians from nuclear power plant, stop bombarding civilians, which is easy to do. It's like, bam, you shouldn't be involved in, in the end game, what would be security framework. So, and I believe if these countries will try to do that, it would be possible to check. first of all, are Russians serious when they are talking about negotiations? Because it's easy for them to demonstrate that we are peaceful, we can do that, okay? And it will also demonstrate to what extent BRICS is influential enough to persuade Putin to do this very simple steps, again, which are practical for all countries. Finally, about the ideology, which was mentioned here. Again, if we are talking such, ANC, MPLA in Angola, they are part of Socialist International. Lulu's Workers' Party is part of Progressive Alliance, which is offspring of Socialist International. So again, we can use ideological factors. You know that what are the basic principles of social democracy? Freedom, solidarity, justice. So what is logical position of your parties? So from ideological point of view, it's very, very clear whom you should support. And just finally, because I think it's a very interesting argument which may be used regarding ideology, regarding the left national liberation struggle, and so on and so forth, and may have a little quiz, not among the panelists, but also among the audience. Who knows what was the formal reason for creation of the first international in 1864, guys? I studied Marxism in the Soviet Union. That's why I'm well prepared to that. The formal reason was to support Polish uprising against whom? Against Russian Tsarism. That was the formal reason why Marx, Engels, Bakunin, and others united and created this first international. Okay, so again, this is interesting fact, just to show that if you're talking about ideology, about national liberation struggle, about left ideas, we can find this argument. The problem is, as we realized, for example, in South Africa, that unfortunately, and in other African countries, that unfortunately Russian presence is strong because of what? Shadow deals, or there's one wonderful word, Geschäft, how to say it, Geschäft, oh, I've forgotten this word. Okay, Geschäft making, yeah, I would say.
We'll come back. Thank you, Alexei, that was amazing. So Maria, so I never know right now whether China is part of the global South or not. I mean, it's an upper middle income country. This is one of those kind of borderline countries at this point. But certainly, so there are many aspects of China which could easily, and should, we have had sort of separate panels on China. But I'm wondering if you could sort of start by talking about, you've written on China's soft power in Africa, and is China kind of contributing to the kind of the muddying of the waters that we've heard about? So the Russian propaganda, is that sort of a factor in the global South?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Lucan, for inviting me. I've learned so much from the panelists, and I think Professor Haran, you're such a persuasive speaker that I can't imagine any of your interlocutors not leaving convinced after your remarks. So yeah, I really enjoyed listening to this, to all the comments. So in terms of China's position and its soft power and whether it's part of the global South, I think first of all, China does position itself as being part of the global South. That's very much at the heart of its rhetoric when it comes to appealing to other developing countries. It positions itself as being part of the South-South solidarity network that has historical rooting, but in the contemporary period, in current era, China positions itself very much as a developer, as an empowering force, as an actor that's been very successful economically, and it's ready to share its wealth, its material resources, its practices, its governance lessons with other countries. So, other speakers, including Sebastian, have talked about Russia as inviting elites and, the elite capture technique. I've been studying this in my project about Chinese approaches, also very much focusing on elites, various officials at a very large scale, thousands and thousands of officials coming to China for trainings. And as a result, leaving at times inspired, but also many of them also leaving with new questions and critiques about what China is doing and whether it's an applicable model for them. When it comes to this muddying the waters or pushing forward certain arguments that may be tilted towards Russia, I've been analyzing Chinese media narratives about the war for quite some time, not always consistently, so I don't want to claim that everything is empirically grounded, but for a number of months for the first half of the year, and then also following up now with a number of other researchers to see whether things have changed by looking at certain events of escalation in the war, to see if Chinese rhetoric has been different in state media. And I have observed that even though China officially is positioning itself as a neutral power, right, we've seen recently some efforts at peacemaking and negotiations and the call with Zelensky, I've observed that in the media there has been a multifaceted tilt towards Russia's perspective in various ways. So one of the tilts is that we talked about the anti-Western framing. The key framing about this conflict, the war, and Russia's aggression has been communicated as the fault of the West. So that's been from the very beginning to now. The West has started this war for multiple reasons, or it hasn't managed to preempt it. And most recently, the West is escalating the war. The focus is often on the United States as the key instigator. And I think this is there are many reasons for this. And the US-China relations have been at one of the lowest points, I think, in recent history. And one of the key emphases of this coverage is really focusing at getting back at the US. It's really targeting the US as opposed to really focusing on the war itself. So the anti-Western framing, I think, is a really dominant frame when it comes to how Chinese state media presented it, not just the state media, but also diplomats, right? Chinese diplomats, spokespersons, official figures that speak very widely on social media have really embraced this framing even more radically than the state media. State media sometimes is actually more modest or sort of more neutral. And the other ways in which it's been tilting towards Russia, in my view, is that the key escalatory points, especially when it comes to massacres and major human rights violations and crimes that have been widely documented, such as the Bucha massacre, Chinese state media has either underreported this particular event or has reported it with questioning, kind of, calling for certain kind of investigations and questioning the outcomes reported by Western media or investigators, suggesting that maybe we need to do more, we need to learn more. These current results are not conclusive. So they're kind of calling out some potential doubts, or maybe there's more room to explore, as opposed to agreeing with or concurring with the findings coming from Western or international agencies. And so that's the second way in which there's this kind of underpinning tilt towards Russia. And the third thing is citing Russian sources. A lot of coverage really draws on Russian sources, state media sources, official spokesperson sources, and speeches. We really see disproportionate reliance on Russian sources versus sources coming from Ukraine or from the West. So that's another, I think, technique in which we see some slight, or at least maybe a little bit more indirect tilting towards the Russian side. And this coverage, of course, this kind of communication is spread not only in domestic Chinese language media, but also in international outlets that are communicating with global audiences. We see this on Twitter. We also see this in coverage by Xinhua News Agency, CGTN, and other outlets. So it is aiming at both global and domestic, but I think a lot of the explicitly anti-Western statements and kind of pro-Russia commentaries are more focused on domestic audiences because of inspiring nationalistic sentiments. And most recently, in his latest Party Congress speech, Xi directly called out the US as impeding on China's rise. So I think much of this discourse is really aimed at domestic communication with domestic audiences. Although more recently, we also see domestic support for China becoming the peacemaker, potentially negotiating and helping negotiate the end of the war. So we see some enthusiasm for this amongst Chinese public based on social media commentaries and various other reporting domestically. So maybe there is a bit of a tilt towards maybe engaging with this kind of image as opposed to more pro-Russia tilt. But I think overall, there's been some significant continuity in how Chinese state media and spokespeople have represented this and talked about this war. So that's just a very brief summary of that.
So I mean, I have to say, at the beginning of the war, I had sort of a glimmer of hope. I mean, it's not very strong, that China might be slightly more sympathetic to Ukraine for a number of reasons. First, it's engaged in a lot of rhetoric about non-interference and state autonomy, and second, obviously, traditionally, it's had a very sort of anti-colonial bent, both of which would apply, to Ukraine. But I'm wondering whether that's at all sort of, how do they sort of square that circle? Here they have the supporting a power which is openly imperialistic, colonial, and which is very much not about non-interference and doing precisely what sort of China has criticized the West for and the like. I mean, do they just simply ignore those contradictions, or how does that?
Well, it's a tricky messaging strategy, and we see mixed signals also coming out of Chinese state media and diplomatic apparatus. We see some diplomats, like the ambassador to France, directly disputing the very sovereignty of post-Soviet states, and then we see, Xi Jinping is making the call with President Zelensky and talking about the importance of upholding sovereignty and kind of declaring that his respect for territorial borders. So we actually see some mixed signals also coming out of Chinese, state diplomacy, and I'm happy to explain, why that's the case. But we do see that there's no uniform message, but also an attempt to really balance those different contradictions that, as Lucan mentioned, trying to speak on behalf of this kind of ideals of anti-imperialism and respect for sovereignty to various other countries, including Central Asian states, post-Soviet states, to kind of reassure them that China is on their side, but at the same time maintaining very close ties with Russia. he himself has visited Russia and has reiterated that this is a very important relationship for balancing against the overwhelming and the really damaging power of the West. So again, kind of talking about how Russia is really significant in this kind of rebalancing, but at the same time speaking in favor of upholding sovereignty. So it's a really contradictory signal. They speak differently to different audiences, and of course, it's very visible to those observing this communication that is full of certain kind of holes or contradictions.
Right. And then I want to turn it to you, Sebastian. So would you say that there's any kind of gap between, public opinion that sort of seems at least, supportive of Ukraine and these various governments' positions on Ukraine? Is that, here we have this story of sort of this elite capture going on both by the Chinese and the Russians, and let's be fair, also by the French, and sort of this sort of what seems to be fairly healthy support for Ukraine's cause, and we have of course Alexei's taxi drivers. But is there kind of a gap there, or yeah?
So I think there will be a gap there simply because, as you know, Luke, and most African countries are not fully democratic. They're authoritarian, or they're competitive authoritarian, or they're hybrid, or whatever adjective you might want to use. So the extent to which African governments speak for their populations varies from country to country. So we now heard about South Africa, which is of course a functioning democracy. We also do know about Senegal, which is the other country that can be considered a functioning democracy. And those two countries have been somewhat on the fence, right? They might sympathize with Ukraine, but they've not condemned Russia in the respective UN votes. I think what might be a good strategy ahead, and I'm really happy to hear that there are initiatives on the way, is if Ukraine enters this conversation as Ukraine, right? Not as a Western ally, right? But if it enters that public debate in the global South as Ukraine, and as Ukraine, it's telling its story, just how it is doing that in the Western media. This will go a long way. It will go a long way precisely for the reasons that Dixel just outlined. Obviously, it's very true that non-alignment does not mean neutrality. And I don't think you need to convince me. But, right, non-alignment and independence is an abstract norm. The question is, how do you interpret that norm in your favor? And I think if Ukraine comes out and Ukraine is leading that discourse, and Ukraine shows that it's taking the global South or Africa very seriously, that's the right strategy ahead. So to answer Lucan's question, yeah, I do think there is a mismatch, but I also think that public opinion in Africa, just as much as elsewhere, is changeable. It's not set in stone. I do want to say that if we talk about global opinion or public opinion in the global South, we should caution that right now Ukraine enjoys unanimous support or almost unanimous support in the West, and that's great. Nothing ensures that it will stay this way, and that's why a lot of people have argued this war ideally is finished as soon as possible and Ukraine emerges victorious, because the longer this drags on, the more critical questions will be asked also by Western publics. And I'm not saying at all that's a good thing, but just looking at the dynamics of Western involvement in conflicts over the course of the last 20 years, the longer this drags on, the more complicated the debate becomes. I do want to throw this in there. And I also want to say that we might just be one US presidential election away from the end of NATO. This is something people don't discuss anymore because Biden won the midterm, Biden convincingly or somewhat convincingly won the last presidential elections. Nothing indicates that this is set in stone. So this support that Ukraine fortunately enjoys right now has been hardly fought over in the immediate aftermath of the war. And it's not clear that this will continue. Hopefully it will continue. And again, I don't think the audience here needs to be convinced. But I think that the audience outside, public opinion, it's much more fickle and much more easy to influence than we like to admit.
Right. Tymofii?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in and add a couple of cents because Sebastian just mentioned something about the variation within, the African continent, and specifically that there is a difference between Senegal and, some other societies. And I just want to back up this claim empirically. Indeed, the survey which I referred to confirms this. There is a big gap between answers from respondents from Senegal and Nigeria and Kenya. I can just give you a couple examples. So if the respondents are asked whether Russia is an authoritarian state, so how many respondents would agree with that? So in Nigeria and Kenya, 80% of respondents agree with that, while in Senegal, 60%. So there is a gap of 20% between them. So 60 is still a big number, but there is still a gap of 20%. And then there are some other questions like whether, let's say you agree that your local companies stop doing business in Russia, and in Nigeria, 50% would agree with that. People on the fence, 50-50, 50 people would agree, 50 would not agree. But in Senegal, it's only 16%. Again, so there is a big gap. Depending on the question, the gap is from 20 to 30% between these countries. And it's, it means that there is a lot of room to work in this region. And yeah, I just wanted to bring these numbers to your attention to support Sebastian's points. Thank you.
Interesting. So I'm going to go to one of the questions from the audience. Evgeny Hutsenko, who's I should add has been involved in the joint project between the Monk School and the Kyiv School of Economics. He asked how to deal with the problem, arguments. I'm going to direct this to you, Alexei. How do you deal with the which I'm sure you've heard tons about, the sort of whataboutism type arguments, which is in some ways Putin's strongest argument, right? Is sort of, what about all these horrible things the West have done? And that received very little support in the global South. I mean, what is your response to that kind of argument? And since you're so convincing, we all want to sort of say exactly what you said.
This is to me?
Yeah. How do you deal with the whataboutism? I mean, what's your kind of response?
Okay, but what do you mean by what about? But what about? You mean
the what about? The argument that Putin makes, which is, you're so horrified by what's going on in Ukraine, but what about the U.S. invasion of Iraq? What about all these other the sort of sins of the West?
Okay, very good. You want to criticize the United States for Iraq, for anything else? Okay, fine. But why should you have double standards? Criticize Russia for what Russia is doing. The answer is very simple here. Okay. If we are talking about some other things like Afghanistan, we could go into more detail and and ask who started the war in neutral Afghanistan, who invaded neutral Afghanistan in 1979. And guys, because you are too young, you do not know what Russian propaganda Soviet propaganda talked about the reason. What was the reason for invading Afghanistan? Because of the threat of American missiles that may be installed in neutral Afghanistan and threaten USSR. Does it resemble something to you? This argument? Exactly what Putin is. Tymofii is surprised. He's very young, luckily. Okay, so yeah, we can go into more details, regarding this. What about is about, what we hear in South Africa. Okay, we have Western Sahara, we have Palestine, we have Chagos archipelago, and so on and so forth. In this case, yes, so that's what I'm saying, because we gave up nuclear weapons. We gave nuclear weapons. It's a unique case in history, and we attacked. So again, it's a bad signal for the whole world. It's the law of jungles. So I think actually, again, this approach can be, there are arguments. And again, definitely United States is bad, and the West is bad. Who would not agree to that? Look, will you agree? The West is bad, right?
Yeah.
Oh, you are hesitating. Okay, but Russia is bad as well. Yeah. So criticize Russia, not only the West.
Yeah, Russia's even worse. But so I mean, what's interesting to me about sort of the reaction, again, this is, Alexei has his taxi drivers, I have my in-laws, is the sort of the extent to which anti-Americanism is really what drives kind of sympathy towards Putin. I mean, would you both agree with that, Sebastian and Maria, or start with you, or Maria? I mean, it sounds like certainly the Chinese policy, I mean, the Chinese government has basically decided, probably without, makes sense, is that, the United States presents a much bigger threat to China certainly than does Russia. So in terms of its geopolitical interests, it makes a ton of sense to focus on the sort of the real threat, which is the United States. So basically, almost like whatever Russia does, they're always going to, focus on what they consider the real threat. Is that right?
Well, I think it's complicated because the Chinese economy is so intertwined with the US as well. And there's so many economic, financial, educational ties, right? So it's on one hand, it's a big threat, but at the same time, it's also a very important country to kind of reckon with. So I think there are a lot of conversations happening in China internally about how to manage this US-China relationship. And there's some efforts taking place on the side that are attempting to restart various types of ties. So I think there's definitely a big concern with the threat of the United States, but I think there's also concern with this war is prolonging, and posing certain economic security threats, image threats. I mean, China's image has declined significantly, especially in Western Europe and in the United States as a result of this war. And in a recent poll, I think it was just maybe half a year ago, which was really striking to me, was that the American public surveyed by Pew Public Opinion polls was most concerned with the Russia-China relations. They thought that it was a very dangerous relationship, that they're coming so close to one another, and this is, the outcome of this war. So there's, I think, a lot of concern about China's image is very much suffering, and they've invested so much in soft power and diplomacy, and it seems to have been kind of dissolved, not just with the war, but prior to that as well, but particularly in the past, year and a half. So there are some efforts, I think, to also rekindle certain ties, more efforts to engage with Europe, more efforts to position China as a peacemaker. So we see some little shifts. I don't think that China is completely kind of absolutist in terms of, well, US is the bigger threat and Russia is kind of a smaller one, so we're just going to kind of align in this way. I think they're trying to manage both sides, and at the same time, not wanting to let go of the Russia relationship either, trying to kind of soften it a bit or repackage it. And we see that during the latest meeting, Putin was much more unequivocal and confident about China-Russia relations, the way he kind of talked about them, whereas Xi was a lot more diplomatic and vague. So we also see some asymmetry in how they talk about each other.
So whenever I sort of was commenting on China, it always felt like ultimately it was the fact that, what was going to kind of prevent, China's full-throated support of Russia was the simple fact that $35 trillion in economic trade is with the West and about 1.5 is with Russia. But then it seems like, at least to the outsider, we've seen a sort of, nonetheless, Xi has been much more, in some ways, it appears to have been increasing its support for Russia, despite, these kind of obvious political, economic reasons for it to maintain good relations with the West. I mean, is that your perception as well? Has China's support, relative to the beginning of the war, increased for Russia in any way, or is it just always, is it stayed the same? I mean,
I wouldn't say it increased. I mean, I think we have to also discern between the symbolic kind of discursive support that's made through, speeches and media commentaries, and also practical support, military support, economic support. Of course, in some sectors, China has been trading actively with Russia, but then also many Chinese companies have withdrawn from Russia and have been very careful to abide by Western sanctions. And when it comes to military support, at least empirically, we haven't seen a lot of evidence for China directly supporting Russia militarily. So I think there are different layers of the support, and I think the discursive symbolic level has been the strongest from my perspective. And in terms of increasing support, I don't quite see even symbolically the support increasing. I think if anything, prior to the war, Russia and China declared a limitless friendship, that they have a friendship with no limits. At the recent meeting, this phrase has completely vanished. There's no more friendship without limits. There's still friendship, but this limitless idea is gone on both sides. And then recently, of course, this phone call with Zelensky, and I just read about pronouncements and the new rhetoric that's towards Central Asian countries, that China is trying to engage them to support peace negotiations. That's a little bit of a shift as well, and maybe a shift towards slightly towards Ukraine, or at least towards becoming a more active participant in peace negotiations. So I see the tilt maybe slightly shifting away from Russia, but not so much as strengthening pro-Russia stance.
Right. Okay. Sebastian?
So just with regard to the footprint of China and Russia in Africa, I don't think those two should be conflated. I think Russia's footprint really is minimal, and it's hyped up in the public debate. It's hyped up in the Western public debate because no one seriously expected Russia to really invade Ukraine. Even in January 2022, most people did not expect that. And so there is a lot of hype about what Russia does in other parts of the world. China's footprint in Africa is gigantic. And over the course of the last 20 years, China has established itself as a serious economic, as an alternative economic development partner. That's very different from Russia, which really is selling weapons and is taking resources out of Africa, just like China, but on much smaller scale. And I think that shows you how effective Russian propaganda really is. And so I think I would be seriously less concerned about Russia's long-term influence on the continent, especially beyond those few francophone, unstable, authoritarian, and resource-rich countries that I talked about. That's really Mali, Guinea, the Central African Republic, and one part of the warring factions in Sudan at the moment. Russia is not a major global power in Africa. It's just very, very good at portraying its weak hand on the continent. And that's why I think there is a real possibility for Ukraine there, for soft power, for Ukrainian soft power, to rechange the narrative. Looking at more recent Afrobarometer data, this is from 2021, so before the Russian invasion, and Africans were asked if they view Russia as if they view Russian presence in Africa as positive. And on average, 35% of Africans said yes, and that number is lower than the number of support for the former colonial power. So it's not that Russia is everybody's darling, right? So there is a real way how this narrative can be changed, and how Russian disinformation and propaganda can be effectively counteracted.
Okay, great. Tymofii, you had something to say?
Yeah, I guess my job for today is, to randomly enter the conversation with some figures and references to the data. So in this survey, the respondents were also asked a question whether they agree with the statement that Russia is justified in wanting to have more influence over its neighbor Ukraine than the West has. Yeah, so this is a very kind of positional question, Russia versus the West. And in total, if you just look into the answers of all respondents in this database, it would be that 40% would agree with this question, that Russia is justified, whereas 45% who would disagree with it. It's really on the margins. And there are some countries where people support Russian influence significantly. These are Serbia, India, Indonesia, and Moldova. In all these countries, like 55–60% of people would agree with that, and only like 25–30% would disagree with that. So there is a big gap between that. So Serbia, India, Indonesia, and Moldova, and all other countries are kind of, almost equal in the numbers of supporters and people who disprove this. So yeah, I would say that this narrative is still out there. And as Sebastian just said, it's probably because Russia is just very good in, in pushing these narratives through media and other channels.
Okay. Maria?
I just wanted to echo Sebastian's comments about Russia's presence in terms of its soft power reach in Africa. In my case was primarily Ethiopia, where it doesn't have the same kind of strategic interest as it does in West Africa. And you just see that the soft power approach is mainly rooted in nostalgia. It's a lot of nostalgia kind of embracing. And I visited and studied the Russian Cultural Center there for quite some time and spoke to different attendants. And you could just observe how the older generation Ethiopians who spent time in the Soviet Union may be attracted to, visiting this particular place and to engaging with Russian cultural diplomacy. But the younger generations are primarily engaged with the Chinese offerings. And a really vivid example of that is actually teaching trainings of Chinese language versus Russian language. Major universities in Ethiopia don't teach Russian. And when the Cultural Center proposed to teach it for free, the universities actually said no, because there are no jobs associated with Russian language skills. And China, of course, links its offerings with jobs of working for state-owned enterprises. So it kind of speaks to this, again, narrative that Sebastian brought up as China as a developer and as also having this really immense and long-standing influence over the past two and a half decades. So I think in that sense, on a more kind of deeper level, Russia doesn't seem to be competing, but then on a level of propaganda, maybe strategic communication, very targeted communication to selective countries, it might be successful. So I think it's important not to kind of overblow also how invested maybe Russia is to in Africa in general. From my experience, it's been quite limited.
So Sebastian, I just had a small question on that. I mean, to what extent is this sort of ANC's support for Russia a product of sort of historical support for anti-apartheid movements, and also obviously in Angola and the MPLA and others? Does Russia benefit from the Soviet Union's support of anti-colonial movements in Africa? That's still what's going on?
It probably most certainly does, simply also because of the exchanges, right, of student exchanges and elite exchanges. And we actually know that goes a long way, right? Making people from other parts of the world studying your country, and then those people becoming bureaucrats or administrative leaders, that opens the door, not to unconditional support, but it certainly creates an intellectual infrastructure on the ground. And that's one of the reasons Wagner and Russia is so successful in Mali at the moment, because roughly half of all Malian civil servants at one point or another have studied in Russia. It doesn't mean they support Russia's invasion, but it's a point of contact for Russian officials. So I would expect there to be similar kind of developments in countries like South Africa, Mozambique, and Angola. So I think so, yes.
Okay. Alexei, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, just to add one more factor to what Sebastian said, plus corruption. The historic legacy plus corruption. Look, I would like to come back to narratives, and I think the main thing is for Ukraine is to change the narrative. So not to view it as a fight between the West and Russia, NATO and Russia, but as a fight between former colonial empire, which is striving to come back, and the state which is or nation which is fighting for its liberation. So if you frame it like that, then it would be echoed very well in this country. So again, I'm coming back to history. I'm saying, just when you remind people that Ukraine was called officially Little Russia, and then pose a question, so how Ukrainians were officially called in Russian Empire, and people are surprised to hear Little Russians, and that Ukrainian language was banned. And then, Putin is basically trying to restore the same. So, and this argument is well received. It changes the emotional approach to the war.
Interesting. So Professor Frank Sisson has an interesting question. He says, in North America, the diaspora communities have been one source of Ukrainian soft power. To what extent is this true in South America? And did independent Ukraine fail to see the importance of substantial communities in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay and work with developing them? I guess that's for you, Alexei. We'll start
Yes.
with you.
Yeah, well, look, I cannot say about how Ukraine officially is using it, but what I can judge from the experience of my delegation, because we were helped by Ukrainian communities in Brazil and Argentina, and yes, they're very, very successful. Though we need to understand, you know, the methods which are used, because sometimes, and Professor Sisson knows it's very well, sometimes it's old diaspora, which is engaged more in, you know, kind of importance of sing and dance and uses symbols, which are important as well. And the new methods, how to reach the audience, how to deal with the government. And I had very good experience actually in South Africa, where the community of Ukrainians is small. They represent young Ukrainian generation, young Ukrainian immigrants, but they are well educated and they know how to make nitty-gritty, you know, how to use social new methods, social work. You know, in Cape Town, there is Ukrainian mural in the center of the city. So just one of the examples, you know. So, so yes, I agree, you know, we need to use these people definitely more and their experience. Again, as I may say, in South Africa, for example, relations between Ukrainian embassy and these activists is very good. Well, regarding Ukrainian embassies, you know, we have different ambassadors. Some are not very impressive, some are very impressive. For example, in South Africa, it's very impressive ambassador. In Indonesia, ambassador who is speaking Bahasa Indonesian very, very fluently. So there are many cases, you know, of Ukrainian diplomats who are very active and who knows how to deal with. Just a very brief example, because I was in Indonesia on 24th of February, and Ukrainian embassy, year of the war, and Ukrainian embassy organized the event. And I was really surprised that I wasn't invited to be a speaker. You know, huge offense to well-known Ukrainian professor. But what Ukrainian ambassador explained to me, no, the panelists are Indonesians experts who knows enough about Ukraine and who will present to Indonesian audience actually Ukrainian arguments, you know. So that's the point. So in some countries, and Tymofii mentions the figures about Indonesia, but there are experts, there are analytical centers, universities, NGOs who are very active and who may contribute a lot.
Great. Well, we'll end on that optimistic note. Thank you all panelists, Tymofii Brik, Sebastian Elischer, Alexei Haran, and Maria Repnikova. Thank you so much for a really fascinating discussion of this important topic.